Hello, this is Murphy Daily on Written by Murphy. I'm continuing with my study of American literature as part of my Immigrants Guide to American Literature series that I've been doing. I have paused a bit, you guys. I have paused because I was grappling with the selection that I'm going to talk about today, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards. This is, once again, a sermon. I would say there are three most famous sermons in America. I just talked about one. I just talked about a model of Christian charity, which was part of the Puritans movement, the very beginning of pre-American history. And here we are again, right? Sorry. This one is another sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. The third most famous sermon in American history is arguably a speech, the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is from 1740, and it's famous for being part of the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is what it was called in America. In England, there was a similar movement called the Evangelical Revival, I believe. And this starts the evangelical movement that is still going today in America, the evangelical Christians who are very, very ready to tell everybody else, you need to come join the church, you need to convert, you need to be saved, you need to be born again. And in fact, Jonathan Edwards uses all these terms. I talked about how in America prior, and in the English-speaking world prior, there was a lot of logic. There was the Socratic method. There is a point, there is logic. We will think it through and we will execute the conclusions we have arrived upon. This sermon, oh my gosh. I want to talk about the context and the text. So I'm going to start with the context because the text is really, really powerful. It's extremely short. I've read it at least 6 times because I've been trying to grapple with it. It is so powerful. As Jonathan Edwards is addressing his audience in America, he's relying on some basic assumptions. He relies on everyone believing in God and everyone believing in hell. These are some assumptions that wouldn't be true of a vast American, of many people in the American audience today. But at that time, he assumed that everyone believed that, and he could reliably do so. So that's the difference in what his audience would believe now and today. But some of the things that are still true now are he reaches out to some very primal human conditions. He leans heavily on guilt and shame. He says, you deserve to be punished in very powerful, primal, visceral ways. One of the things that I learned as I studied this sermon, researching some of it, was that it was the first time that large portions of the African imported slaves and free Africans who came to America began to convert, began to join the Christian religion. And that makes sense to me. The way he speaks would inspire someone who is not even from the Christendom culture. He speaks in a way that's very primal and visceral and urgent. The fact that this movement changed the mind of Americans is a big deal, because that has been a very, that was 1740, what, that's 300 years ago? And all during that time, the African Americans, as a majority, have joined the Christian religion, and this is one of the places where that changed. So I think that's a very important historical moment. This piece of literature, this sermon, this speech, made that change. Not only this exact speech, but speeches like it. Speeches by Jonathan Edwards or George Whitefield or other similar preachers. He's called a theologian. Okay, theologian, preacher. Also, I said at the beginning, the Puritans in America was a religious movement. There is a bit of a difference between the Northern American founding and the Southern. So we can talk about that another time if I find the right example, literary example. But America started with a strong sense of a religion. And here we are, 100 years later, 100 years after John Winthrop made his sermon, with another powerful religious movement. It's called the Great Awakening. It really affected a lot of people. Jonathan Edwards made this sermon. One of his contemporaries, George Whitefield, very famous preacher too, is mentioned by Benjamin Franklin in his autobiography. He heard him and was very impressed with him, even though he himself was not a believer in Christianity. He talks about how, and this is like contemporary of the time, and Benjamin Franklin thought about things scientifically, right? So he says in his autobiography that he was listening to George Whitefield speak, and he thought, wow, this guy is speaking so clearly and enunciating so well. I wonder how far away from him I can go and still hear him clearly. And so he walks very far away until he can't hear anymore. He says, until some other noise made it so I couldn't hear. And then from there, he estimates how many people could fit in this area. And he said that he estimated, I don't remember the exact number, but when he heard later that newspaper reports that George Whitefield was speaking to 40,000 people at a time, he said, oh yeah, actually he could. That seems phenomenal. He didn't have amplification. What? But I believe Franklin. He's saying that these preachers, I will say men, these men were able to speak to very large audiences and have an extreme influence. That kind of large audience all having an emotional experience would be extremely powerful, and it affected history, I would say, well, to this day, maybe forever. So this religious movement at this time, the Great Awakening, was another example of kind of a rolling revival history within America. Let's see. So in the first sermon, I talked about model of Christian charity. John Winthrop says, we are creating a new society. We are creating a new England. We need to be an example for the world. Make it good, guys. Paraphrasing, right? But that's what he was saying. We have an obligation, we have a responsibility. Which is kind of humble. I mean, it has a sense of maybe a sense of humility that we have to get this right. In Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, Jonathan Edwards is not humble in what he knows, in what he says to the people that he's speaking to. He has a sense of arrogant urgency, which continues to be part of the evangelical movement. He is 100% sure of what he's talking about. There is no doubt in his mind, and he will suffer no doubt in the audience's mind that what he is saying is true. That God is angry at the sinners. That it is just that these people suffer and be punished. That kind of arrogant surety is one of the things that can be part of American culture. It's human, but perhaps has a particularly American flavor. So one of the things I wanted to bring out in this sermon, because as I'm discussing American literature, it's like, oh, this is how we got to be how we are. So notice, what I'm talking about that is context. I've only just started to talk about the text itself. Okay. Whew. The text itself is not very long. I've listened to recordings of it, and it's the recordings are about 40 minutes long, which is a pretty long sermon. Probably, I don't know, probably shorter than John Winthrop's from 100 years earlier. But this sermon, unlike Winthrop's sermon, is not cold logic. It is logical in that it hangs together, but he's not appealing to the intellect. He is appealing to the most primal emotions. He's appealing to people's very basic impulses. The biggest one is self-preservation. He's talking about your life. He's talking about avoiding pain. And when he's using biblical context, he's talking about avoiding eternal pain. The story that Jonathan Edwards assumes his audience believes is that there is a hell and there is an eternity, and that every single human being deserves to go to hell and be punished for eternity. That's a horrible thought. That's a nightmare. And some part of every human being is willing to entertain nightmares. He doesn't rely only on these primal fears. He also relies on some of the most compelling and beautiful metaphors and stories. As I've been grappling with this, I've tried to paraphrase some of these snippets and stories that Jonathan Edwards creates. Trying to paraphrase them doesn't do them justice. I completely recommend everybody going and getting a recording of this sermon because it is so powerful. I could listen to it. I feel like, oh, I need to learn what he's saying because I need to learn these techniques that he's using. They're just like a gut punch again and again and again. Wow, this guy knew what he was doing. No wonder everybody said yes. All right, the context of the sermon itself. He begins with saying, you are doomed. You deserve to die. You know you deserve to die. Not only do you deserve to die, but death is extremely close to you. Death could happen at any moment. These are things that deserve to die and to be punished. Okay, maybe that's arguable, but every single person knows that they are mortal. So he talks about mortality, and he talks about people's sense of shame, which most people have a strong sense of shame and guilt. It's part of us as human beings. And the sermon is only 40 minutes long, and it isn't until 3/4 of the way through that he talks about there is a day of mercy. So he says, you can be saved from this horrible fate. It reminds me of the best possible infomercial where they're like, but wait, you can now take advantage of this glorious opportunity that you have, right? So very deep into it, after painting the picture of how much danger everyone is in and how much they're going to suffer with no possibility of saving themselves, he says at the very end, this is the day of mercy, and you can save. You can be saved. At the very end, just this slight little hope, and he's still like, yeah, you can, you can barely, you don't even deserve it, but you could be saved because God is merciful. I'm going to read one quote because this is not even the best one. Again and again and again, he gives little snippets like this. He says, the bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string. And justice bends the arrow at your heart and strains the bow. And it is nothing but the mere pleasure of God, and that of an angry God, without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood. Wow. The sermon is full of these types of metaphors. I find them Shakespearean in how beautifully evocative and really primal they are. These are the sorts of examples. I mean, an arrow pointed at your heart. These are the sorts of examples. And he also talks about spiders being held above the fire, bridges breaking. At any moment, you could go down into the torments forever. They're the kind of scary stories that humans have listened to and been moved by since the beginning of language. It's a really amazing sermon. It had a huge effect on the history of America and the world, and therefore has a place in American history and should be read. I could barely break it apart to make this presentation about it because it was so powerful, and it deserves to be included. And I recommend to everyone to go check it out so that you can understand why America is the way it is now. And it's phenomenal. I wish I could break it apart even more because I feel that this has some masterful techniques in persuasion. I could. It would take a lot of time just to separate out how very powerful it is into its component parts. So that's my treatment on A Sinner is in the Hands of an Angry God.